The grab-rail failed 9 seconds before the princess's carriage reached the widest point of the chasm, and Nell Ashworth felt it in her stomach before she heard the alarm. It was a small wrongness at first, a shudder through the floor of the ceremonial car that no one else on the Sunward Causeway seemed to register, buried as they were in silk-wrapped ribbon-work and the low, formal hum of 600 sorry throats humming the ceiling hymn in unison. Then the second rail strut gave, and the carriage dropped its nose a full hand's width, and every voice on the causeway broke at once. Nell was already moving. She had one hand on Princess Rowan's shoulder harness before the girl's own scream cleared her throat, and her other hand found the emergency stanchion bolted into the floor beside the princess's bench, the one she had quietly identified and memorized on her second week in this posting, the way she memorized every exit and every failure point in every room she was ever paid to stand in. "Sella, brace behind me. Rowan, hands on the rail now." Her voice came out flat and certain, the voice she used for children who needed calm more than comfort, and both princesses obeyed her before their minds had caught up to the order, the way 16-year-olds obeyed a voice that clearly already knew what came next. The carriage lurched again, the whole ceremonial car swinging out over 400 meters of open air above the hollow gardens, held now by a single intact rail, and a support cable never designed to bear the full weight alone. Below, through the crystal floor panel meant to let the crowds beneath admire the princess's passage, Nell saw the ornamental chasm garden spin lazily, stone terraces and silver-leaved trees turning like something viewed from the wrong end of a telescope. She didn't look at the drop twice, she looked at the cable. It was fraying at the housing, not snapping, a slow unraveling under sudden uneven load, the kind of failure that gave you perhaps 40 more seconds if nothing else went wrong, and everything about the tier pattern told her this had not started 40 seconds ago. Someone had weakened that rail joint long before the procession ever left the spire. "Marshal," she shouted toward the lead guard car, angled just ahead and now scrambling to reverse. "Reverse thrust on the tow sled. Don't cut the tether. Cutting it drops us the rest of the way." Marshal Deco Rel, Palace Guard Commander, 3 decades of service etched into the gray plating along his jaw, looked back at her with an expression she didn't have time to parse and shouted the order anyway. Because whatever else he thought of the human companion riding with the royal twins, he had heard the difference between guessing and knowing in her voice, and he trusted the second one on instinct, even as his face said he'd examine that trust later. The tow sled's engine screamed in reverse. The carriage jerked, arrested its slide by half a meter, then began, agonizingly, to climb back toward the causeway's solid span. Nell kept both princesses pinned against the bench with her body weight and her forearm, watching the failing cable the whole way, counting the strands as they gave one by one, doing math she'd done 100 times in a very different uniform. Distance to solid ground, rate of unraveling, margin for error. The margin held barely, and the carriage's rear wheels struck the causeway's stone lip with a crack that rattled every tooth in Nell's head 3 full seconds before the cable finally let go, and the front half of the empty tow sled dropped away into the hollow gardens alone, trailing sparks like a dying comet. Silence came down over the Sunward Causeway in pieces, the hymn dead, the crowd's breath held, 600 throats gone still at once, and into that silence Princess Rowan Vehent, 16 years old and shaking, said the only thing that seemed to fit. "That wasn't an accident." Nell didn't answer her. Not yet. She was still looking at the fraying stub of cable where it had torn free of the housing, at the too clean angle of the cut buried under the obvious wear, and something old and cold moved through her chest that she had not let herself feel in 4 years. She knew that cut. She had made cuts like it herself once in a very different life, under a very different name. By the time the princesses were escorted back into Halworth Spire under triple guard, the story had already begun changing shape around them, the way stories always did in a court that fed on fear, the way other courts fed on flattery. Lord Regent Corwin Thane arrived at the medical wing 40 minutes after the crash, his robes immaculate, his 4 attendants gliding a half-step behind him in the particular silence of people who had rehearsed their concern. He was old even by sorry standards, his feather down gone the silvered white that marked 8 decades of service, and he had the specific gravity of a man who had spent those 8 decades learning exactly how much sorrow to show in public and exactly how little to feel in private. "A tragedy," he said, standing over the princesses where they sat wrapped in recovery blankets, refusing the offered restorative tea with identical stubborn tilts of the chin. "The third mechanical failure to touch this line in as many months. First the waterworks beneath the Queen's own chambers, then the failure of the sealing bell during the memorial rites. Now this." He let the silence sit, let it do the work his voice wouldn't. "One begins to wonder whether the Vhent line itself carries some manner of ill fortune the Dominion is meant to read. Or whether someone keeps cutting our cables, my lord," said Princess Sella, 16 minutes older than her twin sister and considerably better at holding her own face still, "and calling it fortune so no one has to look for a hand." Thane's expression did not change, which told Nell more than a flinch would have. "A grieving girl's instinct," he said gently, to the room rather than to Sella directly, "and an understandable one. Grief looks for enemies because enemies are easier to bear than chance." He inclined his head a precise, correct degree toward Nell, standing at the princess's shoulder where she had not moved since the medical staff cleared her of injury. "Your companion showed remarkable presence of mind on the causeway. Remarkable, for a contract servant with no formal guard training on her registry." "She did what needed doing," Sella said. "That's usually enough of an explanation." "Usually," Thane agreed and left it there, and Nell felt the weight of the unfinished sentence settle onto her shoulders like a hand she couldn't shrug off. She had spent 3 years in this posting learning exactly how much of herself she was allowed to show, and she had shown, on the sunward causeway, at least 4 seconds more than that allowance covered. Kesthallow had been Queen Alanya Vhent's homeworld for 41 years before the wasting sleep took her, a poison the court physicians still called an illness. Out of some mixture of mercy and fear, neither the twins nor Nell had ever fully understood, though Nell had her private theories about which of those 2 motives ran the Regency Council. Alanya lay now in the spire's deepest medical ring, twin hearts beating in the slow, syncopated rhythm of a body locked somewhere between sleep and ending, kept alive by machines the Sorry had built for exactly this kind of grief and never, until 3 months ago, needed to use on a reigning queen. The twins visited her every evening. Nell went with them every evening. She had never once, in 3 months, heard either princess cry in front of the machines, and she had come to understand that this too was a kind of grief the Sorry simply performed differently, no less real for being folded so tightly out of sight. The Regency Council had governed in Alanya's place since the 2nd week of her illness, per law, per precedent, per every scrap of Dominion custom that predated the spire itself. Lord Regent Thane chaired it. He had chaired councils before 3 different monarchs, had buried 2 of them, had a reputation for patience so total it had become, in the corridors where servants like Nell were meant to be furniture rather than witnesses, its own kind of dread. The princesses' claim to their mother's throne was not, on paper, in any danger. It was ironclad by blood, by ceremony, by the sealing rite that had bound them to the succession the day they were born. But paper had never once, in the history the archive scrolls recorded, stopped a regent who wanted more time. Nell found the fragment 2 hours after the crash, in the pocket of her formal coat, where she had shoved it without thinking the moment her hand closed around it on the causeway floor. A curl of alloy no bigger than a fingernail, sheared clean along one edge and jagged along the other. The kind of double edge you only got from a shaped breech charge burning through metal from the inside, rather than a strut simply fatiguing under load. She sat alone in her small staff quarters that night with the fragment balanced on her palm under the desk lamp, turning it slowly, and let herself remember, for the first time in 4 years, exactly how many of these she had planted with her own hands. HFY Reconnaissance Wing had not built its charges for elegance. It had built them for deniability, small, quiet, capable of turning a support structure into scrap in a way that any halfway competent engineer would file, afterward, under fatigue rather than sabotage, because the alternative was admitting someone with training had been there first. Nell had carried 6 of them on her final mission, 4 years and 1 lifetime ago, on an extraction that had gone wrong in every direction at once, and left her the only member of her unit whose name didn't end up on a memorial wall. Mostly, she suspected, because the people who wanted the mission blamed on someone living had needed a name they could still summon to a court-martial. She had run. She was not proud of it most days. She was alive because of it every day, and had learned to hold both of those facts at once without letting either one win. The fragment in her palm had been cut by someone trained the same way she had been trained, or close enough that the seams matched. Someone in the Sari Dominion, or someone working for them, had access to human military-grade breach ordnance, and had used it to try to kill 2 16-year-old girls in front of 600 witnesses and call it bad luck. Nell closed her hand around the fragment and did not sleep that night, and told herself, the way she had told herself every night for 4 years, that she was simply keeping watch. It was a smaller lie than most of the ones she lived inside, and easier most nights to believe. The council convened at dawn, an unusual hour chosen, Nell suspected, specifically because it left the princesses too underslept to argue well. She stood at the chamber's rear wall in the servants' alcove, invisible by design, close enough to hear every word. The sealing rite instituted by First Warden Corvin, Thane said, unrolling the ceremonial text with hands that did not shake, provides for exactly this circumstance, a reigning line rendered vulnerable, its heirs unproven, its fortunes visibly troubled. The renunciation clause exists not as punishment, but as mercy. It asks only that the heirs demonstrate before the full court and underweighing that they are fit to hold what fortune has placed in doubt. He looked at last directly at the twins, seated stiff-backed at the chamber's center. I move that the clause be invoked. Sela and Rowan V. Hent will stand a formal proving before this court, within 1 turn of the near moon, or the regency shall continue in perpetuity, as law allows when no fit heir presents. 1 turn, Sela repeated, 3 days. The clause specifies no minimum, Your Grace, only that it be sufficient for the court's purpose. Thane's voice carried no triumph in it at all, which was, Nell thought, the most frightening thing about the man. He had built an entire career on sounding exactly as reasonable as the worst thing he did. The vote came down 11-4 in Thane's favor, and Nell watched Councillor Vashti Orr's hand rise with the majority a beat before her eyes flicked, just once, toward Marshal Rell at the chamber's edge. A small, private confirmation between 2 people who already knew how the vote would land before it was called. Nell filed the look away with the fragment of alloy, 2 small true things in a room built entirely out of careful lies, and understood, watching Sela's spine go rigid and Rowan's jaw lock, that whatever came in the next 3 days, she was not going to be able to protect these 2 girls by staying invisible any longer. The problem, which she turned over for the rest of that long gray morning, was that visibility for her was not a small risk. It was the only kind that could end with her life. 3 floors below the council chamber, in a study lined with old shipping manifests he kept for sentiment rather than use, Lord Regent Corwin Thane received Marshal Rell and Councillor Orr separately, an hour apart, and told each of them a slightly different version of the truth, because he had learned across 8 decades that trust was a resource best spent in small, unequal portions. The rail failure bought us the claws, he told Rell, pouring 2 measures of chilled amber wine neither of them would finish. It does not, on its own, buy us the throne. The girls will survive a proving. Girls generally do. The weighing tests composure, not competence, and grief makes for excellent composure when the grieving have something to prove. He set the second glass down untouched. We require a second failure, one that occurs during the proving itself in front of the full court, framed in such a way that no one present doubts the vehement line is simply, tragically, cursed. And the human? Rel asked. She read that cable faster than any officer on my roster would have. I've run patrol drills with veterans who couldn't have called that reverse thrust order in the time she took. Thane's feather-down settled, slow and satisfied, the closest expression he permitted himself to genuine pleasure. Then we should find out who trained her to do it, he said. A servant with a dead paper trail and a soldier's instincts is either very lucky, martial, or very useful to us. I suspect, once your inquiry finishes its work, we will find her considerably more useful discovered than ignored. To Counselor Orr, an hour later, he said only that the human's papers would not survive close examination, and that a scandal involving a fugitive foreign combatant hiding inside the royal household would do more to unseat the vehement claim than a dozen failed rail struts ever could. And Orr, who wanted very much to believe that her own hands stayed clean in all of this, chose to hear only the part about scandal and not the part about what precisely would need to happen to the princesses to make the scandal land at the right moment. Nell learned none of this directly. She learned the shape of it the way she had learned to read every dangerous room she had ever stood in, from the angle of Rel's attention on her across the corridor 2 mornings later, sharper now, cataloging rather than merely noting, from a junior clerk's badly hidden nerves when he came to collect her staff registration papers, for a routine review, nothing to trouble yourself over, from the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when she entered it that had not been there a week before. She had 4 months of savings, a change of civilian clothes, and a Rudolph Kesthallow she had kept memorized for exactly the kind of night when running became the only rational choice left. She spent the next 2 days not running, and told herself it was because the princesses needed her, which was true, and did not examine too closely the second, harder truth underneath it, that some stubborn, unkillable part of her wanted, after 4 years of disappearing correctly, to finally do one thing that couldn't be filed away as a mistake. Princess Rowan found her in the small garden off the medical ring on the evening of the second day, where Nell had gone to think without an audience, and failed to notice she'd acquired one. "You knew what that fragment was," Rowan said, without preamble, dropping onto the bench beside her with the particular teenage bluntness that made Sella wince and made Nell, privately, like her more. "I saw your face when you found it in your coat. You knew exactly what it was." "I knew it wasn't an accident," Nell said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Nell looked at her, 16 years old, jaw set in the same stubborn line as her sister's but worn on the outside instead of buried, feather down at her collar, still faintly ruffled from 3 days of a grief. She refused to perform correctly for the cameras, and made a decision she had been circling for 2 days without quite letting herself land on it. "It's a military breach charge," she said. "Human-made. The kind designed to look like fatigue afterward, so no one goes looking for the hand that placed it." "How do you know that?" "Because I used to be the hand." Rowan didn't flinch, which surprised her. The girl simply turned the information over, the way she turned over most things, testing its edges before deciding what to do with it. "You were a soldier." "An officer. A long time ago, a long way from here." Nell kept her voice level, kept her eyes on the garden's still water rather than on the princess's face, because she had learned that confessions went easier without witness contact on both ends. "I did a job that went wrong. People died who shouldn't have. I ran before the people who blamed me for it could finish deciding what to do with what was left of me. I've been running since. Nell Ashworth isn't real. I made her up on a transport dock 4 years ago, because I needed a name that didn't have a warrant attached to it." "What's your real one?" Nell was quiet a long moment. Marin, she said finally. Marin Osai, lieutenant commander once of a unit that doesn't officially exist anymore either. I haven't said it out loud in 4 years. Rowan sat with that, Featherdown going still and thoughtful, and then said, in a voice much older than 16, my mother used to say the Dominion mistakes silence for peace more often than it should. She used to say the quietest room in the spire is usually the one where the worst thing is being decided. She looked sideways at Nell, at Marin, with something that wasn't quite trust yet but was building toward it with real speed. Whoever cut that cable is in one of those rooms right now, deciding the next thing. And you're the only person in this spire who's ever proven she can read a room fast enough to matter before it's too late. Rowan. I'm not asking you to be a soldier again, the princess said. I'm asking you to stop pretending you aren't already one. She stood, brushing garden dust from her formal skirts, 16 years old and entirely unwilling to be managed. Sella's been quietly having the archive staff pull every maintenance record on that rail line for the last 2 days. She thinks the same thing you do. She's just better at not saying it out loud until she's certain. A small, humorless smile. You should talk to her. She'll trust you faster if she thinks the idea was partly hers. Sella Vihent's private study occupied a narrow tower room 3 floors above the state apartments. Chosen, she told Nell without being asked, because it had exactly 1 door and no windows large enough for anything but a very small, very determined bird to enter through. A detail that told Nell more about how the elder twins' mind worked than any formal briefing could have. Rowan says you used to be a soldier, Sella said, not looking up from the maintenance ledgers spread across her desk, 3 assistants' worth of research condensed into her own small, exacting handwriting in the margins. I'd like you to look at something before you decide how much of that to confirm. She turned the ledger around. Nell Marin leaned over it and felt the cold, familiar click of a puzzle piece sliding home. The rail maintenance contract for the Sunward Causeway had changed hands 11 weeks ago, quietly, through a shell logistics firm registered to a shipyard consortium on the Dominion's outer ring. A consortium, the ledger's tightly annotated margin noted, whose primary silent investor was a holding trust bearing, 3 legal layers down, Lord Regent Corwin Thane's own seal. He's owned the company responsible for inspecting that rail since before it failed, Sella said quietly. Which means either the inspection was never done, or it was done and the report was buried, or someone from that consortium's payroll had legitimate maintenance access to that rail joint for weeks before the procession, Marin finished. Enough time to plan a charge that would read as fatigue to anyone who didn't already know what fatigue actually looks like at the sheared edge. She set the fragment of alloy on the desk beside the ledger, the first time she had shown it to anyone. This didn't fail on its own, Your Grace. It was cut. By someone trained to make a cut look like an accident. Sella studied the fragment for a long moment, 16 years old and utterly still in the particular way that Marin had come to recognize as the twin doing the most dangerous kind of thinking. The kind that didn't flinch from where the evidence actually led. You could have told the marshal, Sella said, 2 days ago, handed him the fragment, told him what you just told me. Instead you sat on it. Because the marshal answers to a council that voted 11-4 to give your uncle exactly the excuse he wanted, Marin said. And because the moment I hand over evidence that proves I know what a breach charge looks like well enough to identify one by touch, someone is going to ask where a governess with a dead paper trail learned that particular skill, and I will not have a good answer that keeps me in this spire long enough to finish protecting you. Sella's eyes, dark and sharp and entirely too knowing for 16, held hers without blinking. Then we have the same problem, she said. You're hiding something that would end you if it surfaced at the wrong moment, and so is my family's claim to a throne that spent 41 years being real right up until it became inconvenient for someone else. Something in her expression shifted, softened by a degree that cost her visible effort. Rowan trusts you. My mother's physicians trust you. You're the only member of this household the machines don't have to remind twice about her dosage schedule. I've watched you for 3 years be more careful with us than anyone else in this building who's paid to be. I don't need your real name today, Nell. A pause, deliberate, testing. But I'd like it eventually. From you, not from whatever finds it first. Marin felt something in her chest loosen, half an inch, for the first time in 4 years. Eventually, she agreed. Right now, I need every scrap of maintenance history you can pull without your uncle's people noticing you're pulling it. And I need to know exactly who has had unescorted access to your mother's medical ring in the last 3 months. Why the medical ring? Because whoever cut that rail is patient enough to buy a shipyard 11 weeks ahead of using it, Marin said. That's not the profile of someone who improvises. That's the profile of someone who's been building toward this for a lot longer than 3 days, and your mother's illness is the reason this council exists at all. Sella's face went very still, the particular stillness of someone arriving somewhere she had already half suspected and hoped never to have to fully believe. You think someone poisoned her? I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if they didn't, Marin said. And I have stopped believing in remarkable coincidences. Marshal Rell summoned her the following morning under the flattest pretext he could manage. A formal debrief on the Causeway incident, required, he said, for the guard's own after-action file. And Marin understood, walking into the narrow briefing room off the guard barracks, that the summons had nothing to do with paperwork. He had a training dummy rigged in the corner. Canvas stretched over a steel frame shaped roughly to sorry proportions, and a data slate open on the table between them showing footage of the Causeway rescue pulled from 3 different angles. Sit, he said, and she sat. Walk me through the reverse thrust order, not what you told the regent, the math behind it. She could have deflected, claimed instinct, luck, a servant's desperate guess that happened to land right. She looked at his face instead, closed and exact, patient in the specific way of a man who had spent 30 years learning to recognize a lie before it finished forming, and decided a partial truth would serve her better than a whole one that wouldn't survive his scrutiny anyway. Cable was fraying at roughly 40% of total load-bearing capacity, uneven distribution across the remaining strands, she said. A full stop meant full weight transfer onto a housing already compromised. Reverse thrust redistributed the load back along the tether's original vector instead of concentrating it at the failure point. Bought us maybe 30 extra seconds of intact cable. It was enough. Rell studied her for a long moment. That is not governess arithmetic. No, she agreed, it isn't. I have run this footage 11 times. He said, and 11 times I have watched a woman with no guard registry move through a structural collapse the way I would expect from an officer with combat engineering training. I do not enjoy being lied to in my own household, companion. I enjoy it less when the lie is standing between 2 princesses and whatever comes next. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. I am not asking you to confess whatever you are hiding. I am telling you I have not yet decided what to do with what I already know, and that decision depends entirely on whether it threatens the 2 people I have sworn my life to protect. It doesn't, Marin said. Whatever I am, Marshal, whoever I used to be, I am not the threat in this building. I would very much like the chance to prove that instead of simply saying it. Something in his jaw eased fractionally, the smallest possible concession from a man built out of 30 years of careful ones. Then prove it, he said, before someone with less patience than me finds the same footage and draws a worse conclusion. He rose, ending the interview as flatly as he'd begun it. I will not report you today, companion. I make no promise beyond today. It was not trust. It was not even close to trust. But it was 30 more hours than she'd had walking in, and in a week built entirely out of borrowed time, 30 hours was a fortune. The banquet 3 nights before the proving was, by ancient custom, meant to be a gesture of unity. The full council and both princesses seated at a single long table beneath the spire's oldest hall, sharing bread cut from a single loaf as a public reminder that the Dominion did not eat while it fought. Marin stood at Rowan's shoulder in her formal servant's grey, watching every dish arrive from the kitchens with the particular attention of someone who had once been paid to notice which cup at a table held something the others didn't. She caught it in the tremor of the server's hand, a boy no older than 20, sorry, sweating faintly despite the hall's cool air, setting Rowan's portion of spiced marrow fruit down a half-second later than everyone else's, and a half-inch further from her reach than protocol demanded. Marin's hand closed over the dish before Rowan's fork could. "Allow me, Your Grace," she said, lifting it as though to inspect the presentation, the small courtesy of a companion checking her charge's food that no one in the hall thought twice about, because it was the kind of thing companions did 100 times a season, and nobody noticed the 101st. The scent hit her half a breath later, faint, bitter, underneath the marrow fruit's sweetness, a chemical note she recognized from a very different kind of briefing 4 years and 1 lifetime ago. Contact toxin, slow-acting, designed to mimic the same wasting sleep that had claimed the Queen, so that if it worked, the Council would have 2 more tragic, unrelated illnesses to mourn instead of 1 clean answer that pointed at a single hand. "There's a fault in the marrow fruit storage," Marin said, loud enough to carry to the nearest servers but not the high table, setting the dish down and covering it smoothly with her own untouched portion of bread. "I'll have the kitchen send a fresh plate." She caught the young server's eye for exactly as long as it took to watch him understand that she had understood, and watched him go the color of old parchment. "Perhaps you'd walk with me to the kitchens," she added gently, "and explain to me exactly which batch this came from." He did not run. She had half expected him to, and was grateful he didn't, because the alternative, chasing a poisoner through a state banquet in front of the full Regency Council, was not a scene she could have survived without questions she had no safe answers for. He told her everything in the narrow service corridor outside the kitchens, in a voice gone thin with fear. A payment, 3 weeks ago, from a man he'd never seen before and never would again, delivered through a contact he owed a debt to. No names, no faces, just a vial and an instruction, and a threat against his mother's medical care that had made refusal feel impossible. Marin believed every word of it, and hated, distantly, how easy it was to believe, because it meant whoever was orchestrating this had learned, a long time ago, exactly how to make ordinary frightened people complicit without ever showing their own face. "You're going to walk back in there," she told him. "Finish your shift and say nothing to anyone. Tomorrow morning, you're going to bring me the name of whoever handed you that debt, and I am going to make sure it goes nowhere near your mother." She held his gaze until she was certain he believed her. "This is the only mercy anyone in this building is going to offer you. Don't waste it." He gave her the name the next morning, scrawled on a scrap of kitchen ledger paper pressed into her palm during the breakfast service, hand still shaking. A mid-level logistics agent on Marshal Rell's own household staff, 3 degrees removed from the marshal himself but drawing wages. The boy swore, from an account that traced back to the same shipyard consortium already sitting in Sella's ledger. The circle was closing, and closing in a direction Marin had known, somewhere under the part of her that still wanted to believe otherwise, since the moment she'd found the fragment in her coat. That night, long after the banquet hall's lights had dimmed, and the last of the household staff had shuffled off to their own quarters, Marin made the same round she made every night since the causeway. A slow, unhurried circuit past the princess's apartments, the medical ring, and since 3 days ago, the narrow tower stair leading up to Sella's study, because a room with 1 door and no true windows was exactly the kind of place someone patient might eventually decide was worth searching in the girl's absence. She heard it from 2 floors below. Not a crash, nothing so careless, but the particular hush of a lock being worked by someone who knew what he was doing, followed by the softer click of a door easing open against its own hinges. She took the last flight of stairs without a sound, 4 years of habit returning to her feet before her mind had finished deciding to trust them, and found the study door standing a hand's width ajar, lamplight spilling faint and blue from a portable data unit clamped to the terminal where Sella kept 3 days' worth of ledgers, cross-references, and the fragile, painstaking case Marin had helped her build. The intruder was sorry, plainclothes, competent enough to have bypassed the door's lock-in under a minute, and careless enough to have left his back to the doorway while he worked. The mistake of someone who had been told the household's human companion posed no threat worth watching for, and who was, in the next 4 seconds, going to regret believing it. Marin crossed the room fast and low, and had one arm locked across his throat, and his wrist twisted hard behind his back, before he'd finished registering that the door behind him had opened at all. He was strong, stronger than the kitchen boy, stronger than either guard from the garden, and it cost her a bruised knuckle and a torn seam at her shoulder to keep him pinned face down across Sella's own desk while he thrashed, but 4 years of going soft had not, it turned out, cost her the part of her training that mattered most. Knowing exactly how much force a joint could take before it stopped being a threat and started being an injury she'd have to explain. "Whose orders?" she said, low, close to his ear, while he strained uselessly against the hold. He didn't answer, he didn't need to. The data unit clamped to the terminal told her everything his silence wouldn't. A wipe-pen copy rig, the kind built to strip a terminal's memory clean in under 90 seconds and leave nothing behind but an unremarkable power failure, its housing stamped, when she finally pried it free with her free hand, with the same shipyard consortium's registry mark she had by now come to recognize on sight. Sella arrived at the doorway a full minute later, roused by the muffled struggle, Rowan a half-step behind her still tying the sash of a sleeping robe, and both princesses stopped dead in the threshold at the sight of their governess kneeling on a stranger's spine in the middle of a study that, 3 hours earlier, had held nothing more dangerous than paperwork. "He came for the ledger," Marin said, breathing hard, not loosening her grip. "Someone decided the evidence was more dangerous to them than I am." "Which means they know we have it," Sella said, and her voice, for the first time in 4 days, shook not with fear exactly, but with the particular vertigo of watching a threat she'd understood only in the abstract turn, all at once, entirely physical and entirely real. "Which means the purity ordinance isn't really about you at all, is it? It's a second net. If the sabotage doesn't work, if the poison doesn't work, if breaking in here doesn't work, they still have a way to remove the one person standing between us and whatever they try next." "Yes," Marin said, because there was no version of a comforting lie that would survive the next 3 days, and she had decided, somewhere in the last 4 hours, that she owed both these girls better than comfortable ones. "That's exactly what it is." She marched the intruder down to Marshal Rel's own night duty officer herself, refusing to hand him to anyone lower in the chain who might quietly lose the paperwork before morning, and stood over the formal intake until his name, his registry, and the Wyprig shipyard stamp were all logged under witness. One more thread, thin but true, added to the account she was already, quietly, assembling for a court that hadn't yet agreed to hear it. Rel found her afterward in the corridor outside the barracks, still favoring the shoulder she'd torn wrenching a stranger off a princess's desk, and studied her for a long moment with an expression that had shifted, since their conversation that morning, into something she couldn't yet name and didn't have the energy to guess at. 30 hours, he said quietly. "I told you I'd give you 30 hours before I decided anything." He glanced at the intake ledger, at the shipyard stamp already circled twice in his own night officer's hand. "You may have just bought yourself considerably more than that." She did not get to finish following that thread before the Dominion Purity Ordinance landed on the household staff roster 2 days later, read aloud in the servants' hall by a clerk who took no visible pleasure in it and no visible discomfort either, which was somehow worse. Effective immediately, all contract staff of non-Saudi origin serving within the royal household were to submit full biometric and origin documentation for review, citing recent security concerns regarding the stability of the succession. Marin stood very still in the back of the servants' hall and understood, with total clarity, that the review would not survive contact with her papers, and that whoever had drafted the ordinance had drafted it precisely because they already knew that. She had perhaps 36 hours before the review reached her file, and 3 days until the proving itself, and somewhere in that overlap, she was going to have to find a way to protect 2 princesses from an assassination she couldn't yet fully see the shape of, using a set of skills that the moment she used them in public would end whatever life she had left to lose. The Terran liaison office on Kesthallow occupied 4 modest rooms on the spire's outer ring, staffed by a skeleton crew whose primary job, as far as Marin had ever been able to tell, was making sure the handful of human contract workers on the planet didn't die of homesickness or bureaucratic neglect before their postings ended. She had avoided it carefully for 3 years, the way she avoided every institution with the word Terran attached to it, and she walked through its door on the evening of the ordinance's announcement anyway, because 36 hours did not leave room for careful anymore. Captain Priya Holt looked up from a desk buried under requisition forms with the particular weary alertness of someone who had spent 30 years learning to recognize trouble the instant it walked in wearing a civilian coat. "You're Ashworth," she said, "companion to the Vehent twins. I know your file. It's thinner than a file that thin has any right to be." She set down her stylus. "Close the door." Marin closed the door. "I need to know if Operation Latchkey is still an open court-martial," she said, and watched Priya Holt's face change by exactly 1 careful degree, the look of a person recalculating a great deal very quickly and deciding not to show most of it. "I need to know if there's any version of clearing my name that doesn't end with me in a fleet-holding cell within the hour." "Latchkey," Priya said the word slowly, like she was testing whether it would burn on the way out. "You're Osai." "I was." "You're supposed to be dead, or on a border world somewhere the fleet stopped bothering to look 4 years ago." Priya leaned back, studying her with the frank, assessing look of an officer sizing up a soldier rather than a stranger sizing up a suspect. "Latchkey's case file was reopened 18 months ago. Not for you, for the officer who ordered the extraction team into a kill zone. The intelligence packet had flagged as compromised 6 hours before your unit ever launched. There's a second inquiry running now, quietly, on whether that officer buried the flag on purpose to protect a contract with the very people your team was extracting the defector from. She let that settle. Nobody's found the surviving officer who could testify to the timeline, because she ran before anyone thought to ask her." Marin felt the floor tilt half a degree under her, an old, familiar vertigo she hadn't let herself feel in 4 years. "You're telling me I could clear it?" "I'm telling you the fleet's been looking for you for 18 months for a reason that isn't the reason you think it is," Priya said. "Doesn't mean walking back in is safe. Means it might not be suicide anymore. Those aren't the same thing, and I'm not going to pretend they are to make your next 48 hours easier." "I don't have 48 hours, Marin said. "I have 36 before a Dominion inquiry reaches a file that won't survive being opened, and 3 days until 2 16-year-old girls stand a trial that somebody in this spire is planning to turn into a second assassination attempt while framing me as the reason it happened." Priya Holt was quiet for a long moment, and then reached into a locked drawer and produced a data slate old enough to have a physical port, and set it on the desk between them. "Then let's build you a timeline good enough to survive a fleet inquiry and a Dominion court in the same week," she said, "because God knows nobody else on this rock is going to do it for you." They worked through the night, Priya pulling archived fleet logistics manifests that had somehow never been fully sealed, cross-referencing shipping routes for the Shell consortium that owned the rail contract, and Marin feeding her everything she'd gathered from the ledger: the fragment, the poisoned dish, the frightened kitchen boy's scrawled name. Until, an hour before dawn, the picture that emerged from both threads at once made Marin go very still. The shipyard consortium funding Thane's shell company had, 18 months ago, also supplied logistics support to the very extraction contract that had gotten Marin's unit killed on Latchkey. A coincidence Priya flatly refused to call a coincidence, tracing the ownership chain 3 more layers down until it terminated in a holding trust registered, in the end, to a name neither of them recognized, until Priya cross-referenced it against a Dominion trade registry and found, buried in a decade-old filing, Corwin Thane's own seal. "He's not just moving against the V-hint line," Marin said slowly, the pieces settling into a shape too large and too ugly to have guessed at from any single thread alone. "He funded the operation that got my unit killed 4 years ago." Which means whatever the defector we were extracting actually knew, it was something Thane needed buried badly enough to burn a human military team to keep it that way. "Which means the timeline you need to clear Latchkey," Priya said, "is the same timeline that proves Thane's been laundering weapons-grade sabotage equipment through Dominion shipping lanes for going on 2 years. She sat back, and for the first time that night, something that might have been grim satisfaction crossed her face. "You want my professional opinion, Lieutenant Commander?" "I haven't heard that rank out loud in 4 years, Marin said, and something in her chest ached at hearing it now, offered back to her like a coat that still somehow fit. "Get used to it," Priya said. "Because my professional opinion is that you don't have a hiding problem anymore. You have a timing problem. Whatever you're planning to do at that proving, you'd better be planning to do it in front of every witness that room can hold, because a man who spent 2 years burying evidence this deep isn't going to stop burying it just because you asked nicely." Marin left the liaison office 2 hours before dawn with the data slate, a partial timeline that might survive a fleet inquiry, and a plan that terrified her considerably more than running ever had. She was halfway back across the spire's outer ring when the attack on Rowan happened, and she was 3 minutes too far away to stop it before it started. The princess had gone, against every safety protocol her sister and the marshal's remaining loyal officers had drilled into her for 3 days straight, to the small private garden off the medical ring, the same garden where she'd cornered Marin 2 nights before, because she wanted, she would say afterward, 5 minutes alone with her mother's window before the proving swallowed the rest of her life whole. Marin heard the first shout from 2 corridors away and ran. By the time she reached the garden, 2 of Marshal Rel's own household guards, men whose faces she recognized, whose names she had exchanged pleasantries with in the mess hall a dozen times over 3 years, had Rowan backed against the garden's stone rail, one of them already reaching for the girl's arm, while the other kept his weapon trained loosely on the empty air behind her, the posture of men executing an order rather than improvising a crime. "Regent's orders," the nearer one said when Rowan tried to twist free. "Protective custody, on the council's authority, pending the inquiry into her household security." It was, Marin understood in the half-second it took her to cross the last 10 meters of garden path, an almost perfect lie, plausible enough that any witness who arrived a minute later would find nothing but 2 guards escorting a princess to a room she never left again, and no one to say afterward that it had looked like anything but protocol. She did not announce herself. She did not give either man the half-second of warning that 4 years of careful invisibility had trained her to always give first, to always leave herself the option of retreat. She simply closed the last 3 meters at a dead run, and put the nearer guard on the ground with a strike to the side of the knee that dropped 200 pounds of sorry muscle like a felled tree, and had the second man's weapon arm pinned, and twisted before he'd finished registering that the companion he'd never once considered a threat had just moved faster than either of them had trained to counter. "Rowan behind me," she said, and the princess obeyed instantly, shaking, pressed against the garden's stone rail while Marin held the second guard's arm at an angle that promised real damage if he tested it further. "You have no authority," the guard managed, through clenched teeth, "to lay hands on council personnel. And you have no authority to remove a sitting princess from her own household without her sister's countersignature," Marin said, "which tells me the paper you're operating on wasn't signed by anyone who expects to answer for it in daylight." She released his arm with a shove that sent him stumbling clear, and stood between the two guards and Rowan Vehent with her hands loose and ready at her sides, breathing hard, every careful year of hiding stripped off her in under 10 seconds. Marshal Rel arrived 90 seconds later, drawn by the commotion, and took in the scene, his own men on the ground and staggering, the princess unharmed, the human companion standing between them with a stillness that had nothing servant-shaped left in it at all, with an expression Marin couldn't read and didn't have time to try. "Explain," Rel said to the guards, in a voice that promised the explanation had better be good. "Protective custody order," the first guard said, still rubbing his knee. "Regent's seal. She attacked us without provocation." "Show me the order," Rel said. There was no order. Marin watched the guard's face confirm it before his mouth found a lie fast enough to matter, and watched Rel's expression close over into something flat and furious, and understood in that moment that whatever else the marshal was, cautious, political, careful never to plant his flag too early on either side of a fight he could feel coming. He had not, until this exact second, fully believed his own regent capable of ordering an unarmed 16-year-old girl seized off Dominion soil without paper to cover it. "Both of you," Rel said, "are relieved of duty pending my own inquiry effective now." He looked at Marin for a long, considering moment, feather down along his jaw standing faintly, sharply raised, the sorry expression she had learned over 3 years, closest to open suspicion. "You moved like a soldier, companion." "I moved like someone who wasn't going to let a 16-year-old girl get dragged off by 2 men with no paper to justify it," Marin said. "Call it whatever you need to." Rel didn't call it anything then. But he didn't look away from her either, and Marin understood, walking Rowan back toward the state apartments with her heart still hammering, and her hands finally starting to shake now that no one needed them steady, that the 36 hours Priya Holt had given her had likely just collapsed to considerably less. She was right. By the following morning, the inquiry into her household file had accelerated past routine and into urgent, and by that evening, a formal notice arrived at the state apartments, delivered by a clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. Nell Ashworth's registered origin documentation had failed verification. A formal detainment order would be executed at the conclusion of the renunciation proving, to allow, the notice specified with a courtesy that felt like a blade wrapped in silk, minimal disruption to the court's ceremonial proceedings. Marin read it twice, standing alone in her small staff quarters, and understood exactly what it meant before she finished the second pass. They were not going to arrest her quietly before the proving, where it might raise awkward questions about timing. They were going to let her stand at the princess's shoulder through the entire ceremony in front of the full court, and take her the moment it concluded, publicly, visibly, as the final image the Dominion carried out of that hall. The doomed Vehent twins, propped up by a fugitive foreign combatant hiding in their household, exposed at last. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of image that made a second tragedy during the proving itself look less like an assassination, and more like the Vehent line's ill fortune finally, mercifully, running its course, one clean, devastating afternoon that let the Regency continue in perpetuity with no one left alive whose testimony could contradict the story. She had less than a day to find out how they planned to make that second tragedy happen, and every hour of it now ran under a clock with her own name written on the far end. Not every house in the Dominion had waited for the court to decide which way to lean. Word of the detainment notice had traveled fast through the spire's quieter corridors, and by that evening a formal messenger from House Keith, a minor line, cautious, never openly aligned with either the regent or the crown across 3 generations of careful neutrality, arrived at the state apartments with a sealed offer, conditional support at the proving, should the princesses arrive with evidence sufficient to survive open scrutiny and silence otherwise. It was not loyalty. Sela recognized it instantly for what it was, turning the sealed message over in her hands with a tired, humorless smile. "They're hedging," she told Rowan and Marin both, in the tower study, the ledger and its growing stack of corroborating threads spread across the desk between them, "waiting to see which of us survives the week before they commit to anything." "Then let's give them a reason to stop waiting," Rowan said, and there was something steadier in her voice than there had been 4 days ago, a hardness Marin recognized because she had spent 4 years cultivating the same thing in herself. "We don't need every house. We need enough of them watching when it happens that no one can bury it afterward." They spent that final evening the way soldiers spent the night before an operation, rather than the way princesses were meant to spend the night before a ceremony. Not in prayer or ritual, but in plain, exhausted rehearsal, Marin walking both girls through exactly how the weighing would unfold, where the 6 false guards were likely to position themselves given the hall's sightlines, what to do if the dais itself became the danger rather than the safety it was built to represent. Sela absorbed it with the same exacting stillness she brought to her ledgers. Rowan asked harder questions than her sister did, sharper ones, the kind that came from someone who had already decided fear was a luxury the next day wouldn't allow her. "If something happens to you in there," Rowan said near midnight, when the rehearsal had finally run its course and exhaustion had worn both girls down past formality, "I need to know you actually believe you're worth saving too, not just us." Marin didn't have a clean answer for that, not yet, not with 4 years of careful invisibility still sitting heavy in her chest. "Ask me again after tomorrow," she said, which wasn't a yes, and Rowan, 16 and far too perceptive for her own comfort, seemed to understand that it was the most honest answer she was going to get that night, and let it stand. The final piece came from the kitchen boy, found trembling outside her quarters an hour before midnight with a second scrap of ledger paper, and a story that had cost him, she suspected, most of what remained of his nerve to deliver. The logistics agent he'd named had been overheard, 2 nights running, coordinating a delivery of ceremonial honor guard to the Aurora Hall for the proving 6 additional men. Credentials issued through Marshal Rell's office but never logged in the Marshal's own duty roster, arriving under an authorization chain that traced, when Marin cross-referenced it against Priya Holt's data slate at midnight, back to the same shell consortium sitting at the bottom of every thread she'd pulled all week. 6 armed men, unaccounted for on any legitimate roster, entering the Aurora Hall disguised as ceremonial guards, on the one day every member of the Regency Council, every Dominion noble house, and both princesses of the Vihent line would be seated together in one room. Marin sat with the data slate glowing in the dark of her quarters, the fragment of alloy cold in her other hand, and understood that there was no version of the next 20 hours that ended with her quietly disappearing before dawn. There was only a version where she walked into the Aurora Hall as exactly who she used to be, and stopped this the only way she had ever known how. Not with a speech, not with evidence alone, but with her hands in the room before it was too late to matter. She spent what remained of the night writing down everything. The ledger, the fragment's origin, the shipyard consortium's ownership chain, the kitchen boy's testimony, Priya Holt's latchkey timeline, the 6 unlogged guards, every true thing she had gathered in 4 days folded into a single account. And beneath it, in handwriting she hadn't used in 4 years, she wrote her real name for the first time since the transport dock where she'd buried it. Marin Osai, Lieutenant Commander, HFY Reconnaissance Wing, Terran Fleet. She was done running before she finished writing it, and the relief of that decision, even with everything still ahead of her, felt like the first full breath she'd taken in 4 years. The Aurora Hall filled to its last seat by mid-morning. 600 nobles and council members and Dominion citizens packed beneath a ceiling of pale gold latticework that let the morning light fall in long, ceremonial bars across the marble floor. And at the center of it all stood the proving dais, empty but for a single carved rail of dark wood, worn smooth by 4 centuries of hands. High Adjudicator Misa Wren presided from a raised seat at the hall's northern end, ancient and precise, her formal collar bearing the 7 small silver discs that marked 7 decades of judicial service, her feather-down cropped close and pale in the manner of a woman who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority because she simply, entirely was it. She called the court to order with a single strike of the ceremonial rod against its resonance plate, and the sound rolled through the hall like a held breath finally released. "The renunciation clause has been formally invoked," she said, "by the lawful vote of this council, against the claim of Sella and Rowan v. Hint to the sorry throne. The clause requires that the heirs undergo the weighing before this court, a testing not of strength, nor of blood, but of the truth each carries when speech is stripped of ornament. Let the heirs approach the rail." Sella and Rowan crossed the marble floor together, formal robes catching the light, hands not quite touching but close enough that Marin, standing in the servants' alcove along the hall's western wall, with the council notice still folded in her coat pocket like a countdown, could see the small, deliberate solidarity of it. 2 girls, 16 years old, walking toward a judgment built to break them, refusing to let the walk look like fear. The weighing rail carried a faint current when a hand closed around it, a sorry biological tell, feather down along the wrist picking up the subtle arrhythmia of a heart under the specific strain of deception, translated by the rail's ancient mechanism into a visible shift of color along its worn grain, gold for truth spoken plainly, a deepening gray for anything the speaker's own body doubted. Marin had watched it explained to her once, early in her posting, with the same matter-of-fact wonder the sorry reserved for a biology no human companion could ever fully share, and had filed it away, the way she filed away everything, as a detail that might someday matter. Today, watching Marshal Rell take up a position near the hall's eastern archway, with 6 unfamiliar men in ceremonial guard colors falling into a loose, deliberate formation around the dais's edges, she understood exactly how much it was about to matter. The men were wrong. Not obviously, their armor bore the correct heraldry, their bearing passed for discipline at a glance. But Marin had spent 4 years learning to read the particular stillness of soldiers waiting for a signal rather than performing a ceremony, and these 6 carried it in every line of their posture. Eyes tracking exits rather than the dais, hands resting a half-inch closer to their sidearms than ritual required, a formation that placed 2 of them, unremarked, directly beneath the section of latticework ceiling that Marin's memory, cross-referenced against 3 years of walking this hall for the Queen's weekly audiences, placed almost exactly above the dais's central support column. Sella reached the rail first and closed her hand around it, and the ancient wood beneath her palm bled slowly, steadily gold as she spoke the formal opening words of the proving, her voice carrying clear and unbroken through the hall's vast silence. Marin didn't wait for Rowan's turn. She was already moving along the alcove's edge, unhurried, unremarkable, a servant crossing a hall on some small errand no one in that room had ever once looked at twice, until she was close enough to the eastern archway to see, tucked into the base of the central support column exactly where she'd guessed it would be, a small dark housing no larger than 2 fists, wired into the column's decorative latticework with the same clean, deliberate cuts she'd found on the Sunward Causeway's cable 4 days before. A breach charge, positioned to bring down the section of ceiling directly above the proving dais, at whatever moment the 6 armed men decided the court's attention was fixed most completely on the princess's hands. She had perhaps 90 seconds before Rowan finished the opening words, and the council moved to the weighing's second phase. The moment every account of the ritual she'd read agreed drew every eye in the hall to the dais at once. Marin crossed the last stretch of marble floor at a dead run. The nearest of the 6 guards turned at the sound of her footsteps a half-second too late, reaching for his sidearm as she closed the distance, and Marin was inside his reach, and had the weapon turned aside, and his wrist broken against the archway's stone before the rest of the hall had finished registering that something had gone wrong. A second guard came at her from the left. She used his own momentum to put him through the ornamental screen beside the archway, and heard, distantly, the first scream rise from the gathered nobles as 600 people who had never once seen violence inside the Aurora Hall's 4th-century history began, all at once, to understand that they were about to. "Everyone down. Get away from the central column," she shouted, in a voice that cracked across the hall's marble acoustics with the flat, absolute authority of someone who had given that order 100 times before, in rooms considerably worse than this one, and watched, with something like grim relief, the crowd nearest her break and scatter toward the walls on instinct rather than argument. Marshal Rel's face, when she reached him 3 strides later, was a mask of dawning, furious understanding, the exact moment Marin would think later that whatever loyalty he'd been quietly weighing all week finally tipped all the way over. "The column," she said, breathless, already turning toward it. "There's a charge wired into the base, timed to the weighing second phase. Get your real people between the crowd and that dais now, and get the princesses off it." He didn't ask her how she knew. He simply turned and roared the order, and Marin was already 3 more strides toward the column when the remaining 4 false guards, understanding their moment had collapsed early, abandoned subtlety entirely, and drew their weapons in the open. What followed was not elegant. It was fast and hard and over in under a minute, and Marin would remember it afterward less as a sequence of blows than as a single continuous motion. Turning a drawn weapon aside and putting its owner into the marble floor, catching a second man's strike on her forearm, and answering it with enough force to end the exchange in one movement, feeling, distantly, the ache of every one of the 4 quiet years she'd spent letting these particular muscles go soft finally announce itself in her shoulders and knuckles, and not caring, because on the dais behind her Sella had already thrown herself bodily across her sister the instant the shouting started, shielding Rowan with her own back in a gesture that owed nothing to training and everything to 4 days of watching a servant teach her. Without ever saying so directly, what it looked like to put yourself between danger and the people you decided mattered more than your own safety. One of the remaining false guards broke off and lunged straight for the dais, reaching past Sella's shoulder for Rowan's arm, and Sella, 16 years old, untrained, terrified in every visible way except the one that mattered, drove her elbow into the side of his throat hard enough to stagger him a full step backward, then hauled her sister bodily behind the dais's carved rail while he was still choking for breath. It was not elegant either. It bought Marin the last clear second she needed. Marin reached the column with 2 guards still standing between her and the charge, and made the only choice that made sense in the 3 seconds she had left to make it. She went low, inside the reach of the nearer man's weapon, and used the same breach-disarm technique that had once been the first thing HFY taught every recruit before anything else, because a live charge in a crowded room did not care how elegant the solution looked, only whether it worked. It worked. She had the housing's access panel open in 4 seconds, the charge's arming sequence exposed in 6, and her hands steadier now than they had been in 4 years, steadier than she'd had any right to expect, pulled the detonator lead free with 8 seconds left on a timer she hadn't let herself look at until it was already stopped. The hall went for one suspended heartbeat, entirely silent. Then Marshal Rel's loyal guard had the last of the 6 false soldiers face down on the marble, and High Adjudicator Wren's voice cut through the settling chaos like the strike of her own ceremonial rod, carrying an authority that 600 frightened people turned toward on pure instinct. "Order," she said. "Order in this court now." She rose from her raised seat, ancient and unshaken, and fixed her gaze on the disarmed device, on the 6 captured men, and finally on Marin, still crouched at the base of the column with the detonator lead in her hand, and every ounce of her carefully maintained invisibility burned away in front of the entire Dominion nobility. "You will identify yourself to this court," the adjudicator said. "Now. Under weighing, if you have the nerve for it, or under simple truth if you do not." Marin stood and crossed the marble floor to the ancient rail, and closed her hand around wood that had tested truth for 4 centuries of sorry speakers, and had never once, in all that time, tested a human heart. "My name is Marin Osai," she said, and felt the rail's current close, cool, and strange around her palm, unfamiliar with the rhythm it found there, hesitating a beat before the grain beneath her hand began slowly to bleed gold, not the practiced gold of a sorry heart under formal control, but something rawer, a single true thing spoken plainly after 4 years of careful lies. "Lieutenant Commander, Terran Fleet, HFY Reconnaissance Wing. 4 years ago, my unit was sent into an extraction that Fleet Intelligence had already flagged as compromised, and every member of it died except me, and I ran rather than stand a court-martial I believed was built to protect the officer who buried that flag rather than the soldiers who paid for it." She did not look away from the adjudicator. "I came to this Dominion under a false name because I had nowhere else to go that didn't end in a cell. I have spent 3 years in this household because I was good at the work and because, somewhere in that time, protecting these 2 girls stopped being a job and became the only thing in 4 years that felt like it mattered more than staying hidden." She reached into her coat and drew out the folded account she'd written through the night, and held it up for the adjudicator, for the 600 witnesses who had not yet moved from where the violence had scattered them. "This is everything I found in the last 4 days. A shell consortium that bought the maintenance contract on the Sunward Causeway rail 11 weeks before it failed. The same consortium's ownership trail, 3 layers down, to a holding trust bearing Lord Regent Thane's own seal. A kitchen server paid to poison Princess Rowan's dinner, and the household staff member who paid him. 6 armed men with no legitimate posting, wired to a charge under this very column, time to kill both princesses, and every witness close enough to the dais to contradict whatever story got told afterward." Her voice did not shake. "And a shipping manifest, cross-referenced by the Terran Liaison Office last night, showing that same consortium supplied logistics to the operation that got my unit killed 4 years ago. Because, whatever the defector we extracted actually knew, it was something Lord Regent Thane needed buried badly enough to spend a human military unit's lives keeping it that way." The silence that followed was not the practiced, performed silence of Dominion court ritual. It was the raw kind, the kind Marin had heard exactly once before, in the seconds before a very different kind of violence had ended her old life, and she watched it break across 600 faces at once as the truth of what had almost happened in that hall finally, fully landed. Counselor Vashti Orr was the one who broke it. She rose from her council seat, feather down trembling visibly along her collar, and said, in a voice that cracked on the second word, "I did not know about the charge. I swear it before this court, I did not know he meant to kill them. I only agreed to the inquiry, the ordinance. I thought it was politics." She stopped, visibly understanding in real time exactly how much of that excuse would not survive her own conscience, let alone a court's judgment. "He told me the human's exposure would end the Vehent claim cleanly. He never told me what else he'd planned to happen in this room today." Marshal Rell stepped forward before anyone could answer her, the intake ledger from 3 nights before still clutched in one hand, and set it, along with the disarmed wipe rig and the identities of the 6 captured men, on the council table for the full court to see. I can corroborate the household intrusion and the shipyard registry mark independently, he said, his voice carrying flat and unhesitating across the hall. I gave this companion 30 hours, 3 nights ago, to prove she wasn't the threat inside these walls. She has spent every one of them proving the opposite is true, and I will not stand silent now and pretend I doubted her less than I did. Lord Regent Corwin Thane, seated at the council's head with 8 decades of careful composure finally, visibly cracking across his ancient face, did not confess. He rose instead, robes immaculate even now, and said, with the last reserves of a lifetime's practiced calm, "This is a fabrication, a fugitive combatant's desperate invention, offered to save herself from lawful detainment." "The rail says otherwise, my lord," High Adjudicator Wren said, and her voice, when it came, carried a coldness that made the entire hall go still all over again. I watched it bleed gold under her hand. I have presided over this court for 70 years, and I have never once seen the weighing rail answer a human heart at all, which tells me either the ritual has broken today, or the truth spoken beneath it was strong enough to be heard regardless of the vessel carrying it. I do not believe, Lord Regent, that this court's ancient mechanism chose today of all days to fail. She struck the resonance plate once, hard, and the sound rolled through the hall like a verdict already decided. Marshal Rell. Take the Lord Regent into custody, pending full inquiry by this court, on charges of conspiracy to murder the reigning line and the deliberate corruption of Dominion succession law for personal gain. Rell moved before the last word finished leaving her mouth, and Thane did not resist, which Marin understood, watching his face in the moment his composure finally, completely failed, was its own kind of confession. The look of a man who had spent 8 decades believing patience made him untouchable, arriving all at once at the discovery that it hadn't. Sella and Rowan stood together at the center of the dais, both of them shaking now that the danger had passed enough to let them, and High Adjudicator Wren turned to face them with an expression that had softened, by careful degrees, into something almost gentle. "The weighing tests composure under truth," she said. "I confess I did not anticipate the court would witness that composure tested quite so literally today. But I have watched both of you, in the last quarter hour, place yourselves between danger and each other without hesitation, answer a court's ancient ritual without flinching from a mechanism you had every reason to fear would fail you, and stand now, still upright, in a hall that very nearly became your grave." She looked between the twins, and then for a long moment at Marin, still standing at the rail with the detonator lead forgotten in one hand. "I do not believe this court requires further proof of the Vehent line's fitness to rule. I believe this court has just watched it, in the only form that ever truly mattered. The formal ruling took the better part of an hour to record, but the outcome was never, from that moment, in real doubt. The renunciation clause dismissed, the Vehent twins' claim confirmed unanimously by a council that had watched its own chair unmasked as a murderer in front of 600 witnesses. The Regency dissolved effective immediately pending a proper coronation, once the twins came of formal age, with a caretaker council, counselor or among them. Her testimony weighed carefully against her complicity, and found in the end to carry more mercy than punishment, given what it had cost her to speak it. Appointed to govern in the interim under terms that gave Thane's remaining allies no room left to maneuver. High Adjudicator Wren addressed the matter of Marin Osai last, once the hall had begun, slowly, to exhale. "You stand accused, under Dominion ordinance, of falsified origin documentation and unlawful residence," she said. "You also stand, under the evidence this court has just witnessed with its own eyes, as the sole reason 2 princesses of this Dominion are alive to hear that accusation read against you. I am not in the habit of pretending those 2 facts weigh the same." She glanced once at the folded account still in Marin's hand, at Priya Holt's data slate now sitting on the council table where Rell had carried it, at the 6 captured men being led from the hall in restraints. This court formally requests of the Terran Fleet Liaison Office a full and expedited review of Lieutenant Commander Osai's court-martial status, on the strength of evidence this Dominion is prepared to offer in her defense. Pending that review, she is granted provisional sanctuary under royal household protection, a status this court does not extend lightly, and will not see revoked on the word of anyone who has not first proven, as she has proven today, that it is deserved. She looked finally to the twins. Princesses, this court understands the sworn shield title has stood vacant in your line for 3 generations. No candidate in that time judged worthy of the old oath. I would not presume to suggest a candidate to you now. But I would observe that this court has rarely, in 70 years, seen an oath more thoroughly earned before it was ever formally asked for. It was Rowan who crossed the dais first, still shaking, still 16, and took Marin's hand in both of hers, not the formal grip of a princess honoring a servant, but the plain, fierce grip of someone who had watched a person choose, over and over, across 4 impossible days, to stand between her and every version of the worst thing that could have happened. "Say yes," Rowan said, quiet enough that it barely carried past the 2 of them. "Whatever she's about to formally ask you. Say yes before I have to ask twice." Marin looked past her, to Sella, standing a step behind with her composure only just beginning to crack around the edges of a very long, very frightened day, and found, in the elder twin's face, the same question asked more quietly and no less completely. "Eventually, you said." Sella's voice wavered just slightly on the word. "You told me you'd tell me your real name eventually. I didn't think eventually would arrive in front of the entire court." "Neither did I," Marin admitted, and something in her chest that had been braced for 4 straight years finally, fully let go. "I'm not a soldier anymore. I don't have a unit, a fleet, a name that means anything back home. I have a court-martial that might still end badly no matter what this adjudicator requests on my behalf, and a set of skills I spent 4 years trying to forget I still had." "You have 2 princesses," Sella said, "who are alive because you didn't forget them quite as well as you thought." She held out her hand, formally this time, the correct and deliberate gesture of a vehement heir offering an oath rather than a request. "The sworn shield doesn't guard a throne, Marin Osai. It guards the people who sit in it. My mother used to say the title was never about strength. It was about the one person in the room who could be trusted to see danger before it arrived, and to choose, every single time it mattered, to stand in front of it anyway." Her hand didn't waver. "We would like that person to be you. Not because a court just watched you earn it in one impossible morning. Because we watched you earn it quietly for 3 years before any of us knew your real name at all." Marin took her hand. The evening after the ruling, once the Aurora Hall had emptied, and the last of the council's formal business had finally, mercifully concluded, she found Priya Holt waiting in the liaison office's small outer room with a fresh pot of tea, and an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something warmer she made no effort to hide. "Fleet responded to the Dominion's request 4 hours ago," Priya said, sliding a printed dispatch across the desk. "Provisional stay on the court-martial, pending full review of the latchkey intelligence timeline. It's not a pardon. It's not close to a pardon yet, but it's the first honest look that file's gotten in 4 years, and given what you handed them today, I'd put good money on where it lands." Marin read the dispatch twice, the way she'd read the detainment notice 2 nights before, and found this time that her hands didn't shake at all. "I'm not running anymore," she said, half to Priya, half to the quiet room, half to some version of herself she hadn't let speak out loud in 4 long years. "No," Priya agreed, pouring the tea. "You're really not." She raised her cup, a small, unceremonious toast that suited both of them far better than anything the Aurora Hall's gold latticework could have offered. "Welcome back, Lieutenant Commander." Marin walked back to the state apartments as the twin sons of Kesthallow dropped low and gold behind the spire's outer ring, past the sunward causeway, where a new rail was already being fitted under guard, past the small garden where a frightened princess had once found her thinking too hard to notice company arriving. Rowan and Sella were waiting for her on the terrace outside their mother's medical ring, where the physicians had told them, only that afternoon, that the queen's wasting sleep, traced now to a slow-acting compound sourced from the very same shell consortium, had a documented antidote, one the Dominion's own archives had simply never been asked to look for, while a regent controlled which questions got asked at all. Elanya Vehent would wake, the physician said. Not tomorrow, not next week perhaps, but she would wake in a Dominion her daughters had already, in every way that mattered, proven themselves fit to inherit. Marin stood between the two princesses on the terrace, watching the light fail gold and slow across the hollow gardens where a fraying cable had first told her, 4 days ago, that a life she'd thought she'd buried was never quite as gone as she'd let herself believe, and understood that she had spent 4 years running from a name because she'd believed, somewhere underneath all the careful reasons, that the woman who'd carried it wasn't worth keeping. She had been wrong about that. It had simply taken 2 doomed princesses, a fraying cable, and 1 very long week to prove it. Sworn Shield, Rowan said, testing the title out loud for the first time, grinning despite everything the day had cost her. It's a good title. Sounds like someone who'd actually stay. I intend to, Marin said, and meant it completely, for the first time in 4 years, without a single careful reservation held in reserve behind the words.